Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the annual immunisation update. My name's Alison Tattersall. I manage the Education and Workforce section of the Hunter New England Central Coast Primary Health Network. Today's session is being facilitated by Hunter New England Central Coast Primary Health Network and presented by Hunter New England LHD. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and those emerging. And we're coming to you today from Awabakal land. This session is being recorded and will become available later in the week in the PHN Education Library on our website. We will be using Slido for questions and the session evaluation survey today. We will require you to fill out the evaluation survey in Slido to receive a certificate of attendance. You can access the evaluation polls and question and answer tabs on the right-hand side of your screen, or alternatively, head to slido.com and enter the code VAX2, so VAX2. A third option is by scanning the QR code on your mobile device, which you'll see has popped up on your screen. Please type your questions in throughout the session, and members of the Public Health Unit team will be typing in responses, and we also have allocated time for a question and answer after the main presentations. As we have a lot of content to cover, we'll have a 10-minute break in the middle of the session, so that will be at 2:15. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers from Hunter New England Health, and it's the Public Health Unit. So firstly, who doesn't need much introduction, is Patrick Cashman, who's the Immunisation Coordinator. Paula Taylor is the Aboriginal Immunisation Health Worker. Rebecca Johnson is Clinical Nurse Consultant in Immunisation. Sharon Saxby is the Clinical Nurse Consultant also at Hunter New England Health. Also helping in the background to answer any of your questions on Slido is Clinical Nurse Consultants in Immunisation, Kirsty Waller and Lucy Williamson. I'd like to now hand over to Patrick. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Alison. That's terrific. And big thanks to the PHN for putting this on. Wonderful partners. We really appreciate it. And this is a special daytime one for people that find attending these in the evening a bit inconvenient. And acknowledge I'm on Awabakal land speaking to you from today. And really important time of the year, this time of the year. It's Close the Gap Day yesterday, Reconciliation Week last week, and the first week of July is NAIDOC Week, so look out for events. Now, Hunter New England put on a terrific Close the Gap event yesterday. It's available both, if you're in Hunter New England, there's an internal link, and if you're external, there's an external link. There's lots of great presentations, including a wonderful presentation from Stan Grant. So that was a real coup to get Stan to speak. And he's a Wiradjuri guy, and Paula, who will be speaking after me, is a Wiradjuri elder from Wellington. So that's just fantastic. So I'll talk about COVID, of course, and influenza, topical at this time of the year as we start to rug up. And we don't have anything to heat our homes, so we've got to keep warm, lots of blankets. And then Paula will talk about the Aboriginal immunisation program. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll do sort of through age groups. I'll talk about vaccinating kids. Sharon will talk about the school program adolescents. Rebecca will talk about vaccinating healthcare worker adults, and then adverse events. And then I'll finish up with cold chain. Really encourage you to get involved in these events, and especially NAIDOC Week. NAIDOC Week is a really good week to get involved, and especially as healthcare workers, the more we're involved, the more we understand people's communities, the better health service we can offer. So that's really important. Big thanks to the H&E hubs. They've done a great job getting lots of vaccines out. So the big hub was set up at Belmont in Newcastle and also in many rural towns around Hunter, New England. There should be another photo there. There it is. So big thanks, and they gave hundreds of thousands of vaccines out. Absolutely fantastic effort. But that's coming to a close at the end of the month, and they will relocate in a much smaller version to Wallsend. So there'll still be publicly available COVID vaccines after the 30th of June, but that will be at Wallsend rather than at Belmont. So big thanks to everyone who was involved, and a special thanks to Andrew and Amanda, Sue and Liz and Sharon and the team down there who ran such a good show. Absolutely fantastic. But of course, when the government gets out of something, where does the load go? To general practice. So if you're working in general practice, you guys have been carrying a huge load the whole pandemic with treating sick people, giving vaccines, trying to keep everyone healthy with other stuff, and you've been given most of the COVID vaccines out in Hunter, New England and in the Central Coast. So great effort. We have an immunisation website, and I really encourage people to become familiar with this website. The team spent a lot of time on it to get information up. Now, as time goes forward, like everyone else, we're under pressure for resources, and if you can find information on the website, that would be great rather than giving us a call. Of course, give us a call if you're stuck, but really encourage you to have a look around on the website and try to find information there first. So COVID, let's have a look at COVID. So this is Hunter, New England COVID cases in the last 6 months. And this is obviously self-testing. So the orange are the rats and the blues are the PCR. And you can see, happily, the number of positive tests is declining. So that's great. So we're starting to see, hopefully, a decline in cases, which is really good. And that's a little bit around the world. So that's for a lot of reasons. One is vaccination. The main reason is we've got 95% of the local population vaccinated. So that's going to put a damper on it. The second is a lot of people have already had COVID. You've probably had COVID, or you know someone who's had COVID. So there's natural immunity as well. And so the thing's sort of going, we don't know if it's going away, but it's decreasing happily, which is really, really good. So the big issue at the moment is Omicron, and there's lots of different versions of Omicron that I'll talk about later. So you can see this is a phylogenetic tree. You can see Omicron on the top there. It's completely separate to the previous Delta and Alpha waves. If you have trouble with the names, this dashing French guy who also just won an election might help. Omicron. You can see here earlier this year that the ratio of people with COVID in Australia was much greater per head of population than around the world. We really had a huge Omicron wave. And look at the ages of the people who were positive. You can see they're really concentrated in the young adults, and older people less so. Now, it's very different with deaths and ICU admissions, but the young people move this virus around the community. Young adults are really the target for that third dose. Really, really important. Now, 12 months ago, all around the world, we saw lots of people who are unvaccinated dying of COVID. And this is a shocking headline from Texas 12 months ago. 9,000 deaths, all but 43 were in unvaccinated people. So some of those would have died before there was a vaccine, and some of those have chosen not to be vaccinated. So incredibly sad when there's a life-saving vaccine and people weren't availing themselves of it, and very, very sad that people died before the vaccine was available. So there was a lot of vaccine misinformation. This is a notorious story of 5 radio hosts in America who were anti-vaccine and saying those things on the radio, and they've all died of COVID. So there's been 1 million deaths of COVID in America alone, which is just really, really sad. But it's moved on now, and it's a different story now. So the unvaccinated, so this is up to May this year from our World in Data. You can see now the unvaccinated are not dying at the same rate as before. So the Omicron is not killing people as much as Delta and the previous waves, which is terrific. That's good. It's a much more mild disease. It's still around. And so who's dying now? So we look on the left, we can see that the unvaccinated really, really present. But then on the right-hand side is with younger people, and on the left-hand side is for people over 65. And if you look at the scale there, you can see the scale's huge. So this virus is still killing people over 65, and they're mainly unvaccinated people. So vaccinating people over 65 is really, really important. So from end of November last year through to February now, in Australia, or just in New South Wales, 1.1 million people infected. So that's only a population of 7 million. So that's incredible. Just in 2 months, from the end of November to February, over 1 million people infected in New South Wales. Hospitalisations over 11,000, ICU over 1,000, and deaths over 1,000. So the death rate for Omicron, about 1 in 3,000, which is still high because so many people got the infection. So it's incredibly catchy. The Delta death rate in comparison was much higher, 1 in 128, so a much more dangerous virus. So it's good news the virus isn't killing as many people. So that's great. Plus the vaccine, plus people have had COVID, so we've got better protection. But it's young people who have been moving this virus around. The famous story from Newcastle, of course, of the nightclub. I'm sure you all know it, spent some time there. But hopefully not on this night, when a lot of young people there, unvaccinated, some come up from Sydney, and it was one of the largest spreading events of COVID in the world. So young adults, really important to vaccinate. And let's look at the case outcomes comparison from Omicron to Delta. So Delta in the middle column, there were 4,000 cases between the beginning of December and halfway through February this year, compared to Omicron, which was 95,000 cases. Hospitalised, even though Delta was more dangerous, there was less people in hospital just because of the large volume of people with Omicron. So over 1,700 people with Omicron. Admitted to ICU, 45 with Delta over 6 months and 89 with Omicron. And deaths, more deaths with Omicron. It's killing less people proportionally, but so many people infected. So this is a really good analysis. This is New South Wales from New South Wales Health data in one of the newspapers. And if you look at the ages, on the left is the population. The COVID cases in the middle mirror the population. These are older people at the top and younger people at the bottom of this graph. But look on the right-hand side, the deaths. COVID deaths are so much concentrated in the older people. So older people now without the third dose and then the fourth dose are really high at risk. So the people at risk are unvaccinated, older people. Now we can't do much, unfortunately, about people's age, but we can give them a vaccine. So younger people, want them vaccinated to stop spreading the virus around. Older people, vaccinated to keep them out of ICU, keep them out of hospital, and to keep them alive. So this is another way of presenting that data. So the green, the population, the orange, the cases, and the green have had 2 doses. So the unvaccinated are 4.6% of cases, but 22% of the deaths. So unvaccinated, really, really at risk. So if you're vaccinated, your chance of dying of COVID is about 1 in 800, whereas the unvaccinated, it's 1 in 126. So 6 times more common for unvaccinated people to die than vaccinated people. So vaccine still has a huge role. Unfortunately, the vaccine doesn't last forever, so revaccination is really, really important. So if you've got those skills in the last 2 years, giving people COVID vaccines, you're going to need to keep those skills and keep that going for a long time yet. So this is the hospitalisations in New South Wales, gender at the top, and then age going from low age to high age on the left-hand side. Now, deaths admitted to ICU in the second right column and deaths in the right column. Now, very sadly, one little child, 12 months old, died of COVID, had comorbidities. But if you look down the right-hand side column, you can see in younger people, there's no deaths until we reach the 50s. And then that really increases after 60 years of age. So older people really at risk of dying. But if you look at the next column at the left, admitted to ICU, there are lots of younger adults admitted to ICU, and if you look at hospitalisation, you can see younger adults well represented in hospitalisation. So this is not risk-free for young people. Young people also have a role in moving it around, so targeting young people, really, really important. But it's not just the unvaccinated, it's also older people, as we've been seeing, people with comorbidities, and in the United States, a lot of the data says that people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder really do badly with COVID. So there's some things we can modify. So there are now variants of concern, and it keeps changing all the time. Just a month ago, there was hardly any BA4 or BA5, and now we're starting to see some. So Omicron there's 5 different variants that we're looking at: BA1, BA2, there's different sorts of BA2, BA3, 4, and now 5. Now, if I had shown this slide a month ago, there would have been nearly nothing in the BA4 and BA5. Most of it's BA2, but you can see some BA4 and BA5 creeping in. But none of them seem to be as deadly or as serious or putting as many people proportionally into hospital as Delta. So this is good news. This is great news. So that virus that was sweeping the world before we had a vaccine killing people, those terrible scenes from Italy and New York, has become more modified and less dangerous. So that's great news. But in Australia, it's on a background of 95% vaccination. It would be very different if we didn't have any vaccination. And this virus is still incredibly infectious. So especially in your clinics, wearing your mask, good hand hygiene, really, really important. So a lot of those variants were given their names in South Africa. So South Africa has a really good virus testing system, and a lot of our data, we're following the South African model. Now, so I show this, and you can see there, 2022 on the right-hand side, the cases have really fallen away in South Africa, which is just fantastic. We'd expect the same to happen in Australia, which is great. The caveat is that in South Africa, they've got so much natural infection, probably more than we do in Australia. So that might change the epidemiology. So is the pandemic over? No. Is this virus still killing people? Yes. Do people still need to be vaccinated? Yes. But it's a much better story than 12 months ago. So this is great. So the virus has become not as deadly, and people are vaccinated. So we've got a really good, really safe vaccine. So this is really important. Now, there are treatments for COVID now. We're not going to talk about antivirals, and we're not going to talk about monoclonal antibodies, but I recommend you, if you're working in GP practice and you're giving those out, I recommend that you go to the Health Pathways, fantastic resource, and that will talk you through that. There's a great dashboard that we can look at briefly, and it just gives you a lot of data, but let's look at some in more detail. Now, this is in the dark blue bar are people that have had their first dose of COVID vaccine. This is up to last Sunday for New South Wales. The red bar is the second dose, but the bar I want you to look at is the bright blue bar, which is New South Wales colours for State of Origin tonight, which is very appropriate. And you can see there the older teenagers and the young adults are really underrepresented with that third dose. So really, really important in terms of decreasing Omicron transmission even further is for young people to be vaccinated. Now, the intervals. So there's lots of new information coming out all the time. Now, you can give COVID vaccine and influenza vaccine to someone at the same visit. You don't have to give them together, but it's probably a good idea with how many visits that you're getting. That's quite safe to do. Now, if someone's still having their primary dose, which is a vanishingly small percentage of the population, you can give one dose and the second dose 8 weeks later. Now, if someone's had COVID disease, the recommendation is that we wait 3 months between COVID disease and the first booster or the third dose. The reason being is that the protection from having the disease doesn't last forever, and the protection from the vaccine doesn't last forever, so you're going to stretch it out. But if they get COVID disease, after 3 months, come in and give them the next booster, and that will stretch out that protection. and 4 months between booster shots. So if someone's had 3 boosters and they're eligible for a winter booster, which is especially people over 65, and they had their previous booster 4 months ago, we can give them that second booster or the 4th dose or their winter dose. All right, so let's have a look at some of these vaccines. So this is all the different platforms. So it's obviously a depiction of the virus in the middle there with the spike protein, all the different platforms. And we're just going to look at the Novavax, the protein. So this is a very similar vaccine. So this is on the market in Australia. This is a very similar vaccine to, in the way it's manufactured, to the Gardasil HPV vaccine. I won't go through all the detail, but the point there is that the machinery of the cell, so this happens in a big broth. This is a big broth, and they use the DNA of the virus in a bacillovirus. Then they put that into another cell, which makes these spike proteins. And those red things are all the spike proteins being produced. Then they're harvested, and that's what's given in the vaccine. So it's a very similar way to how the Gardasil vaccine's manufactured. Then when it's injected into someone, the dendritic cells, which is that funny shaped body there, picks it up and then presents the spike protein after it's injected into the helper cells, and that's how we build up immunity. So this vaccine, there are some people that were worried about having some of the other vaccines, but very happy to have this vaccine. So some people have been waiting for the Novavax. So that's a protein vaccine, COVID vaccine, works really well. But the main one we've been relying on for the last 18 months are the mRNA vaccines. And these are the first mRNA vaccines available. But mRNA vaccines have been worked on for decades. So it is a new vaccine, but it's not a new technology. This technology, they just weren't able to produce it like that. They've been working on it for a long time. So how does this work? So if we look at how a cell works. So in the nucleus of our cell, we have the DNA that has all the genetic material from our mother and father, and that tells our bodies what proteins we need to make. So your kidney cells, your brain cells, the genetic code is in the DNA. But that's all in the nucleus. Whereas the things that make the endoplasmic reticulum is in the cytoplasm of the cell, and they make the protein. So how are you going to get the message or the recipe from the nucleus out to the cytoplasm? You send a messenger, and that's the mRNA. So what these vaccines do is they artificially copy the mRNA for making a spike protein, and we inject that in, and the cell follows that pattern and then makes the protein. So here's another depiction of it. So we've got this is what happens in the body. So on the left-hand side is transcription, where the DNA, which is the double-stranded, then that translates to the mRNA. The mRNA then leaves the nucleus, and translation is when the mRNA runs through the ribosome, a bit like a ticker tape, and that then tells the ribosome what proteins to make, and on the right-hand side are depictions of protein. So we do exactly the same with the vaccine, where we just give so this is like they've got the foundation, then the messenger goes out. It's a little bit like a recipe. So the mRNA vaccine is just that recipe being given into the body, then those proteins can be made. But instead of making kidney cells or brain cells, probably shame, I probably need a few more brain cells, but they make spike proteins that then present to the immune system, and the immune system can copy them. So for people who missed it, the Moderna company is an anagram of mRNA, so that's how they get their name. So that's the only product they make. They make different mRNA products. So we inject the mRNA vaccine into the deltoid, and then that little squiggly thing in that circle, so that circle's a little globule of fat, quite delicate, which is why these vaccines have got to be kept deep frozen until they're reconstituted. And this is not a vaccine that we shake vigorously because they're so delicate. Then that's given in, and then in the cell, at the ribosome there, the ribosome is then got the recipe to make the viral proteins, and on the left-hand side, it's stimulating a B cell, and on the right-hand side, a T cell. So that's the both arms of the immune system. the B cells and the T cells. So that's great. Some vaccines will only stimulate the B cells and make antibodies, but this vaccine stimulates both. So we get really good immunity. So it's very, very unusual to have a bad outcome with COVID once you've had these vaccines, which is fantastic. But you don't really have, there's not much in these. They're very simple vaccines, which is why the handling and the storage conditions is so important. So really, there's just the active ingredient. There's some fats that make up the lipid casing, some salts and sugars and waters, and that's it. So these are incredibly simple. So there's nothing in there that's going to hang around your body for years and cause a problem. Some people say, oh, these vaccines are new. You know, what happens in years' time if something happens? And it's nearly impossible because there's nothing in there that's going to cause a problem years down the track. And the amazing thing here is that this technology can be used because it's a recipe for making proteins. It can be used for all sorts of things, not just for making vaccines. So here's an example of a paper that's saying the missing protein in haemophilia potentially could be manufactured using a messenger RNA. So that means you can inject the messenger RNA, tell the body how to make that missing protein and cure haemophilia. And that's just one example. So hopefully this COVID's given a whole big lot of impetus to messenger RNA technology, and we'll see lots of really good new products come out. So the trials look at vaccine efficacy, but in the real world, it's vaccine effectiveness. And this is just showing that the vaccine's really, really good at keeping people out of hospital, really, really good at keeping people alive. Not so good at stopping infection, but much better than not having the vaccine. We'd see much more transmission of virus around the community if there was no vaccine. So this is just looking at the first 2 years from the New England Journal and looking at the protection. And the incredible thing, mostly with vaccines, the vaccine tries to copy nature. It says, all right, nature, you're a virus, nature, you're a bacteria, you're stimulating the immune system. I'm going to try to copy that. And usually our copy is inferior, and the immunity you get from a vaccine is usually not quite as good as getting the natural infection. COVID's different. The vaccine actually does a better job of protecting you than the infection. So there's been a great course run by the Doherty that has all of Australia's premier vaccine experts presenting at it. Is that right, Rebecca? And one of the guys that presented there gave it the example. So when you get COVID infection, your body's looking at that whole virus and trying to work out how to build up immunity to it. But when we give the vaccine, we give the dangerous bit, the spike protein only, so that the body's just looking at that and can build really good immunity. So that's quite incredible. So just a big reminder, pregnant women really, really vulnerable to viral infections, especially influenza and especially COVID. So this is from 12 months ago, so it's not the Omicron, this is with Delta, but this figure from, these numbers from England just amaze me, that 1 in 6 COVID patients who were in ICU in the UK were pregnant. So 1 in 6 COVID patients 12 months ago in ICU were unvaccinated pregnant women, and 20 of the 118 COVID patients who needed ECMO were pregnant women. So pregnant women really, really vulnerable to COVID and to influenza as well. So giving COVID vaccine and influenza vaccine during pregnancy is life-saving, and there'll be some protection go to the baby when they're born. So we'll just look at we'll look at Vaxtracker in terms of vaccine safety. So this just exploded during the pandemic. We were just running Vaxtracker in New South Wales, and then now we're running it right around the country. So we had 33 sites in Queensland, 119 clinics in New South Wales. You can see the numbers there. And we getting direct data, plus a very innovative Aboriginal health worker in Tamworth, Trina, helping with the QR code, and people are enrolling themselves. So these are all the different clinics around the country, from the Kimberley to Tasmania, Cape York, absolutely fantastic. So Vaxtracker really took off monitoring vaccine safety, and this is something we started in our little unit here in Newcastle. So Vaxtracker has been going since 2011, and if we look at the scale on the y-axis there, you can see it's in tens of thousands of people involved, with over 50,000 people involved up to 2020. And then with COVID, that's the same graph, 2020 there, is now shrunk right down, and now the y-axis is in millions of people. So it's nearly up to 5 million people now have been through Vaxtracker in terms of tracking vaccine safety. So that's something we're very proud of, and we've been working 10 to the dozen over the last 18 months tracking the safety of vaccines, and that information goes to Ausvax Safety and to the TGA. So if you're giving vaccines, you can be confident that they're safe. There's been a lot of misinformation around the world, people conflating freedom with being asked to have a vaccine. In fact, if you have a vaccine, we got a lot more freedom now. Because people are vaccinated, we can move around, we can go to the shops, kids can go to school, we can socialise, we can go to the restaurants. That's because of vaccinations. A vaccine gives you freedom. It's not a take away of freedom, it's give you freedom. And of course, the poor people in Ukraine can teach us a lot about what fighting for freedom really means. It's not carrying a placard against vaccines, because vaccines equal freedom, not against freedom. But what's happening at the moment? Winter in the emergency departments. So this is comparing the presentations to New South Wales emergency departments over the years with influenza-like illness, and the big dark line there is this current year up to May. And you can see there the presentations in emergency departments with influenza-like illness, which is cough and fever, are huge and have just spiked right up. So this year we're getting absolutely smashed with respiratory viruses, and I'm sure that's the experience you've got in your GP practice, in your emergency department and in your clinic. So let's have a look at that. Now the flu tracking, which is also a Hunter New England thing, national and going international, tracking respiratory illnesses in Australia and New Zealand and soon around the Pacific. Now the big green line there is the presentation of kids with respiratory illness this year up to the end of May. So kids, so we talked about the spread of COVID around the community is young adults. The spread of influenza virus around the community, kids are overrepresented. So we don't have a COVID vaccine for kids under 5, but we do have an influenza vaccine for kids between 6 months and 5 years of age. So influenza vaccines for kids of that age, absolutely important to protect them, to keep them out of hospital and to stop that virus spreading. So at the moment, there's all sorts of stories, and you would know in your own household and your own workplace, of viral infections really knocking people around, and we really want to get on top of that, and we've got a vaccine for influenza. So this is data for the different strains, and it looks like influenza A is overrepresented. Now, interestingly enough, there's lots of respiratory viruses. So if you have a look here, we're looking at adenovirus, parainfluenza, RSV, rhinovirus, human metapneumovirus, and enterovirus. But I'll draw your attention, so these are the different years again, the current year in green. Now, some of the ones causing trouble are on the bottom left-hand side. You can see that human metapneumovirus is really going up at the moment, causing a lot of those viral illnesses. But look at RSV above that. So the middle one on the left-hand side, RSV is just going crazy. So at the moment, RSV is going huge. Now, RSV will make all of us sick, but especially little infants. Little infants are really overrepresented, have to go to hospital for oxygen. They get really, really sick, very scary for parents in the middle of the night. We don't yet have a vaccine for RSV at the moment. Now, Moderna, before the pandemic, were working on an mRNA vaccine for RSV, which would be incredibly exciting. And we're hoping that that huge investment in mRNA vaccines during the pandemic will lead to a vaccine for RSV. So we don't need less vaccines, we need more. Keep these kids out of hospital. But that's the picture in New South Wales at the moment with the different respiratory viruses. Now, none of those we have a vaccine for, but influenza we do. Now, when we look at the numbers there of the viruses we just showed you, you can see that RSV heaps. Rhinovirus, which is just the common cold virus, really overrepresented, which is not surprising. But that's not going to take you to hospital. That's going to give you a sniffly nose, off colour for a few days. But RSV makes you really sick. Human metapneumovirus can make you very sick. Parainfluenza can mimic influenza. Let's talk about influenza, because that's a disease that we do have a vaccine for. We can do something about that. Now, in America, the burden of influenza, these numbers are so big, I just thought we'd put them up there. Now, looking every year at 9 million to 41 million illnesses, 140 to 710,000 hospitalisations, and what have we got? 12 to 52,000 deaths every year in America from influenza, which can be prevented with vaccination. Now, on the right-hand side, paediatrics. About 188 paediatric deaths from influenza every year in the States. So vaccinating kids, really, really important. Now, this slide talks about a program that we actually don't have here, but I want to point it out because it just shows you how important vaccinating kids is for influenza. So this is from the UK. This is data from a pilot that's now a program they do every autumn. So there is a vaccine, an influenza vaccine, that we don't have available in Australia. It's a live intranasal influenza vaccine, and the school nurses go around and squirt it up the noses of the primary school kids in the UK, all around the UK. And then what happens after that? So what they saw was there was a 94% decrease in presentations to the GP for kids who are vaccinated, 74% decrease of presentations with influenza to emergency departments, and a 93% decrease presentations to the clinic. So that's absolutely fantastic there for the kids, but the kicker is the one on the right-hand side, a 59% decrease in adults going to the GP with respiratory illness. That's because you vaccinate the kids, the virus can't move around the community as much, and you protect everyone. So we don't have this vaccine, we don't have this program, but in your fridges, you've got influenza vaccine for kids over 6 months of age. Really, really important that you suggest it to mums and parents. Influenza vaccine, really important in pregnancy. So during the pregnancy, influenza disease can lead to death, miscarriage, premature labour, early caesarean, and a smaller birth weight. So we really want to be making sure that pregnant women have access. And those two articles there are the reference for giving pregnant women influenza vaccine. Now, the flu virus, this is the flu A, really, really tricky. So with COVID, we've got the one spike protein, but with flu, you've got two, you've got hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and there's 18 different types of them. So really, really tricky to build a vaccine for influenza. Now, in Australia, every year we see about 3,500 deaths, 18,000 hospitalisations, and 300,000 GP consultations. So in terms of the health system getting smashed, influenza's doing a terrible job. So we really want to get that vaccine out there, stop people getting influenza so that hospitals can be doing what they need to do and fix people with things that can't be prevented, like influenza. Every year the strains change. That's the current strains up there. Now, what we really need is a universal influenza vaccine. Yep, that will go from year to year, that we don't have to change every year. So that's the holy grail at the moment for influenza vaccines. This is a paper from the Lancet Infectious Diseases talking about how that progress is going. And it's saying that when in the trial, there was no difference between the placebo and the experimental group, and they stopped the trial because it was futile. So we still got a long way to go before we have a universal influenza vaccine. There is some hope for mRNA. There are some better stories, but just letting you know that it's not going to happen in the next few weeks. So we'll still have to keep going. How do we make influenza vaccines? We grow the virus, and then that's grown in eggs. So it's an egg-based flu vaccine. That's incubated into eggs. It grows in the eggs. Then it's harvested from the eggs, and we use that to make the influenza vaccine every year. And that's why it's strain specific, and that's why it takes a fair amount of time to make these vaccines. Now, there is a new vaccine, a cell-based flu vaccine, which is available on the private market in Australia, And on the way, hopefully, will be recombinant flu vaccines. There are different ways of making flu vaccines, but the main one we use, all our vaccines bar one, is egg-based flu vaccine. So this is, if you need, I really suggest you have this up in your clinic. If you just search for ATAGI influenza vaccines, you get their fact sheet, 2-page fact sheet that has this table on it, and it tells you all the different ages of the different vaccines that you can use. Now, the third one from the right, Flucivax Quad, is the only cell-based one that's only available on the private market if you're interested in that. New South Wales have a great fact sheet, so you can actually see the products and know which ages. So the one at the bottom there, Flu-Ad Quad, is the funded vaccine for people over 65. So that's the vaccine that has a special adjuvant in it, so it's a better response for people over 65 because their immune systems aren't working quite as well as younger people, so they need a stronger vaccine. So that's the funded one. There's also another one available on the private market. So make sure you give the right influenza vaccine to the right age group. Now, funded influenza vaccine, so now it's funded for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, pregnant women, people over 60, it's Kerry Chant, hang on, I just got a call. Kerry, no, it's free for everyone. Everyone? You sure? Yeah, okay. Absolutely everybody. This vaccine's free for everybody now in June. So to the end of June, apart from people under 6 months, it's free for everybody else. So let's please, we really want to get that vaccine out, and we really want emergency departments, not with people with influenza in the waiting rooms, GP practices, and the only way to do that is to vaccinate everybody. Vaxtracker and Ausvax Safety tracking the safety for this vaccine for kids, and it's got a really good safety record this year's vaccine, so we can safely offer that to children 6 months to 5 years of age. So the message is you can get side effects from your influenza vaccine, but they're tiny, yeah? So use your common sense. Now, getting an influenza vaccine is a bit like road safety. You want to wear a seatbelt and don't get in the car with a drunk driver. So don't be a princess, get out there and get your influenza vaccine. Now, very sadly, this is one princess who didn't follow that advice. It ended up in a big stack. You don't want that for your patients, so give them their influenza vaccine. That's probably, I wrote that a while ago, but now it's the big Queen celebration. It doesn't seem so appropriate. But what we do want to do is talk about Aboriginal immunisation, and I'd like to introduce you to Paula Taylor, who will talk about her program of following Aboriginal kids up. This is a really important program. We really need high rates of Aboriginal kids immunised. Paula.
Thanks, Patty. Hi, everybody. My name's Paula Taylor. I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman from Wellington in New South Wales. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the custodians and where we're from today, the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining in with us today. So like Patty said, I'm an Aboriginal health worker with the Public Health Immunisations team, and I work alongside Nat Allen, who sits in Tamworth, and I sit in Newcastle. So together we are part of the Aboriginal pre-calling program, but we also do other things. So part of our program, we call mums before their babies are due for their 6-week immunisations, just touching in with them, making sure that they know where to take their baby to for their 6-week immunisations. They know what they've got to have, what the schedule looks like, and we then share some extra information to them if they wish. We also make sure that they know that they're able to have the meningococcal B vaccine that's funded for Aboriginal children from 6 weeks of age, and that's really important because a lot of Aboriginal mums take their babies to be immunised and they don't get the meningococcal B because they're not aware of it. So please make sure that you're asking every patient, do they identify as Aboriginal, so that that baby can have their meningococcal B vaccine at 6 weeks of age. We also send text messages to families before each immunisation milestones and include special messages like the meningococcal B. We also support the immunisation school nurses, so we go out to the schools and support the schools in a cultural aspect to support students, in particular Aboriginal students, just to make sure that they're comfortable with the whole immunisation program, and in particularly supporting the HPV for Aboriginal girls, because our Aboriginal girls have a higher rate of HPV than non-Aboriginal girls. Also, part of our role is we follow up overdue children, and a lot of those overdue children are errors. So we contact GPs, so a lot of those errors come from GP practices. So maybe just check your data entry when you're doing that and have some sort of follow-up process, because a lot of those errors come from there. We also support the adverse events teams. We make culturally support phone calls, culturally safe phone calls, follow-ups after an adverse event and notification, just to make sure that that person is okay, that they're okay with that process and how that's all being handled. We just provide support for them. So Nat and I work together, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you think that we can help you or your service. Thanks, Patty.
Thanks, Paula. It's such a privilege working with Paula. It's a great service, and she does such a good job. And I really encourage you to work very closely with Aboriginal liaison officers and Aboriginal people who can help you with your work, and especially with the culturally appropriateness of the service that you're offering. In Australia, Aboriginal people often miss out on services, and often non-Aboriginal people like myself can't see why. But when you get Aboriginal people involved in designing the service, you end up with a much better outcome. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about kids' vaccines, then we'll have a 10-minute break, then Sharon will talk about the school program, Rebecca about healthcare worker immunisation and adverse events, then I'll talk about cold chain briefly. There's a fabulous Q&A on the Australian Government website, has answers to lots of questions. It's really clear. This one really intrigued me. Is it true? Can COVID vaccines connect me to the internet? I thought, oh, fabulous. I live in a rural area. I'm always out of service. I'm going to get a COVID vaccine. I'll be able to hotspot myself to my phone. I'll be able to get. But unfortunately, the government tells us that no, having a COVID vaccine cannot connect you to the internet. So I was quite disappointed about that. But anyway, I think the vaccine's worth having, even if you don't get internet connection with it. There was a big quiz show in Australia. This question came up a few years ago, so this is a bit dated. But for kids' vaccines, so you can test yourself, because now we're all very good at immunising adults with COVID vaccines. But the vaccines were we have a special schedule for kids' vaccines. We really want kids to be vaccinated. Added to the National Immunisation Program in 2013 is the vaccine for 18-month-olds, known as the MMR Watt. So the S, T, U or V, and because this is a very knowledgeable audience, despite this current education, it's V, MMRV was added. So the varicella was added to the MMR at 18 months, MMRV, which is a terrific vaccine. Now, unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, because we asked people to stay at home, difficult to get into the GP, the vaccination rates of kids have dropped in New South Wales. So these are New South Wales numbers there. You can see the for Aboriginal people on the left, non-Aboriginal people in the middle, and for everybody on the right. The red are where the numbers have fallen. You can see they've fallen in 5 of the 6 categories. Only school-age 5-year-old Aboriginal children that rates haven't fallen, which is really good news. The graph on the bottom there, you can see a dip on the right-hand side that these have fallen. So we've got to be quite creative. Now, during COVID, GP practices were incredibly creative at being able to get people in safely, vaccinate them, and then get them on their way. Use of car parks, waiting rooms, keeping people separate. We sort of got to do the same with kids now, because the kids' rates are falling. So a lot of parents are finding it difficult to get into their general practice. General practice is the place where most kids get their childhood vaccines. But it's a bit difficult at the moment. We're starting to see the rates fall. So huge, although general practice is getting smashed with respiratory illness, 2 years backlog of other work, these kids, getting the kids' rates up is really important. So you might have to be a bit creative and look at special clinics, running special times that parents can come in. Maybe they can, after the vaccine, they can wait in the car and then just check in with you after 15 minutes that it's safe to go. Everybody was incredibly creative during COVID. We need to use the same skill set for getting these kids back up to date. So these are just looking at the various parts of Hunter, New England. These are kids who are not fully vaccinated at 12 months of age. Now these look fairly good. They're about the sort of 90 to 95% mark. But a few years ago in Maitland, which was about 90%, we drilled down and we found these big blue bars are kids at 12 months, the orange bars at 2 years, and the green bars at 5 years. So even though the headline rate was about 90%, we had about 1/3 of kids over those 4-year period who were not fully vaccinated at 12 months of age. We started a program, it was a World Health Organization program called TIPS. We worked with the PHN, especially wonderful Alison, who did the introduction today. Lots of nurses and GP practices in the Maitland area. Worked really, really hard, everybody. And these are the numbers coming up since about 2013 to last year. So it takes a lot of effort to keep the rate of kids' vaccinations high, but it really is a foundation of primary care, of general practice, making sure people are healthy rather than waiting to their crook. So at the moment, we've got lots of people with influenza disease. That's overwhelming the system. Giving vaccinations about giving it to well people. They stay healthy. They don't come into the general practice. They don't go to the hospital, and the health system can survive. So really, really important message. So the schedule. Now, a lot of us have been giving adult vaccines, COVID vaccines. Maybe you haven't given a lot of kids vaccines yet. So the schedule's there on the left-hand side. It's obviously on the New South Wales Health website. Now, when kids are behind in their vaccines, they might need to catch up a bit. Now, this is, on the right-hand side is a section from our website that we showed you earlier. And including there in the middle is a link to various catch-up schedules. So here's an example of one. So if you've got a kid who's a bit behind and you think, oh, what vaccines do I give them? We've got some helps there on our website. So have a look at that. If you still need some help, then of course give us a call. But the website you'll find really, really helpful. So catching kids up, getting them back on schedule. So a lot of these diseases are diseases of small children. So you don't want to wait till they're too old because they would have been through the danger time for pneumococcus, rotavirus, and diseases that really affect infants. So some of the strategies that Jody, who runs the sort of the kids vaccination program, the AIR program, is recommending personal vaccination, letting families access you, and that's really difficult at the moment because we're trying to keep people with symptoms out of the practice, which is fair enough, but we've got to be a bit creative. Reminder letters, phone calls is really important. Making the next appointment. So don't let someone leave without making the next appointment. Paula, who you just met, and Natalie, Aboriginal health workers. If you've got Aboriginal families that are falling behind, please contact them and check the AIR. Now, Jody and the team are sending letters out to people and to practices, correcting a lot of data and really reminding people for their kids to get vaccinated. So you might see some evidence of that. Now, Paula talked about invasive meningococcal disease, a really, really important to think about for Aboriginal kids and for young adults. Now, the ACWY is free and funded for all children at 12 months of age and for children in the school program at year 10. Now, humans are the only reservoir. This is not something that comes from animals, unlike COVID. Only reservoir for meningococcal disease. And it's in the back of the throat, and it's in about somewhere between 5 and 25% of us at any one time. And for reasons we don't understand, sometimes it gets quite virulent and can make people really sick. And you're familiar with that. You get the non-blanching rash, and you get little kids get really, really sick, lose limbs, go to ICU. Now we've been giving meningococcal C, which is in green, since the early 2000s. You can really see that's nearly disappeared because of vaccination. You can see meningococcus as a whole has disappeared, but you can see the most overrepresented there is in the red, which is meningococcal B, and that's the one that's free and funded for Aboriginal kids. Now, the ages here where people get meningococcal disease, we can see kids under 1 really get meningococcal B. Kids from 1 to 4 get W as well as B. So the program at 12 months, the ACWY, really, really important for all kids. And for Aboriginal kids, really important at under 1. Now, under 1s, the Aboriginal kids are getting meningococcus at a rate about 7 or 8 times more than the rest of the community, which is why that vaccine's funded for Aboriginal kids. And again, you don't want to be giving that vaccine late. You want to be giving it on time in the first 6 months of infancy for Aboriginal kids, and give the parents good information about managing fever. Now, from 5 to 15, kids don't get meningococcus too much. And then from 15 up, I don't know what kids are doing to get bacteria from the back of one throat to another. But happily, that looks like the over 65s are still doing that, so that might be a good sign. But 15 is the age when the meningococcal ACWY is free and funded for teenagers, so really, really important. Now, meningococcal B is not funded at that age, but it may be something you'd think about purchasing if you've got older teenagers or kids off to university. So that's it for the first half. We'll have a break. Then Sharon will come back and talk about the school program. Rebecca talk about healthcare worker vaccination, adverse events, cold chain in the second half. So 10-minute break. What time is it now? 1:56. So we'll come back at 2:05. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you've all made it back from making your cup of tea or your cup of coffee. It's great to see you all today. So I'm going to be talking about school program, but before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this beautiful Awabakal country that we're meeting on today. It's absolutely glorious outside, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all of our Aboriginal people who might be joining our presentation today. Welcome. So my job to talk to you about school program. It's a little bit of a messy program over the last couple of years, but we've had a really, really busy start to 2022. And I'm guessing that you can all imagine why. We've all been disrupted by many things over the last couple of years. So our program usually runs really smoothly and just rolls on over, seeing each school 3 times a year. Kids are always at school, and we get lots of things done. But you can imagine in the last couple of years, due to COVID, we've had lots of different things interrupting our program. We've had constant and unpredictable cancellations of schools and clinics. Kids are not at school due to all sorts of reasons. We had trouble rescheduling schools because schools were desperate to get their own programs up and running when they were at school. And so it was very difficult. At the end of last year, we actually ended up cancelling the whole program. So any of our Year 7 kids that were due for their second dose of HPV at the end of last year didn't get any last year. So we had to roll all of that over into this year's program. So as well as seeing our normal cohort of about 26,000 kids this year, we had to add another 6,000 kids on top of that to fit into this year. So it's been a really tight start to the year. But I'd like to thank you all. If any of you are working in general practice, I know that you guys have been completely inundated with everything COVID and influenza related with your own patients' disease and vaccinations, but you've also been inundated with requests for HPV and Boostrix and meningococcal vaccines from the school program. So we have very dedicated parents who are thankfully not happy to wait for us to come back, but like to come and see you. So we are really appreciative of all the work that you guys have done in supporting this program as well. So our program hasn't really changed over the last couple of years. We see Year 7 and we see Year 10 students. So for Year 7 students, we do our HPV vaccine, which is Gardasil 9. It's a 2-dose course, and we do that in a 6-month gap. So it has to be a 6-month calendar month gap for us in the program, and then we also give them a single dose of their DTPA, which is Boostrix. So that's their first adult booster. And then we see Year 10 for their meningococcal ACWY. So leading up to COVID, Australia was actually on track to successfully eliminate HPV and cervical cancer by the years 2035. So we were well ahead of the rest of the world, who actually set a schedule in 2020 to eliminate cervical cancer as a public health issue in 100 years. So Australia were looking at actually doing that in 15 years. So the HPV schedule that we do, the vaccination schedule, is a really good part of that elimination process. But as you can imagine, COVID has put a spanner in the works with that. We would really like to still see 2035 as being on track for elimination. So we've got a lot of catch-up work to do. So we've had put a lot of resources into catch-up vaccination, because the last thing we want to see is a rise in HPV related diseases in our young women and our young men in a few years' time, all because they missed out on their HPV vaccination because of COVID. So we're working really hard at that, and we're really hoping that you can help us with that. So what do we do for catch-ups in the school program? We have actually extended our catch-up program in the school program. Normally we would only go into Year 8 and see kids for catching them up from the previous year that they've been missed, but we've extended that into Year 9 for HPV and Boostrix. And for meningococcal, we've actually extended it into Year 11 and 12 as well for their meningococcal vaccines. Meningococcal is an interesting one as well. We would think that it's a fairly graphic disease and that this would be in the face of teenagers, but they seem to be almost a little bit reluctant to have their vaccination, and we very rarely get over about 70% in the school program of kids receiving their meningococcal vaccine. Why? Not quite sure. Whether they're supremely autonomous in what vaccines they get, or they just think they're invincible. So there's a lot of education that needs to go into there about them understanding what meningococcal disease actually is and does, and the consequences of that, and how they can easily avoid that by vaccinating. So what are we doing? Our teams, we have 25 teams around Hunter, New England. We make the most of absolutely every opportunity we can to get missed doses into our school kids. So originally, if a child started their HPV vaccination outside of the school program, we couldn't offer them their second dose. But that has changed in our desire to catch up everybody. So if they've received a first dose anywhere, we can vaccinate them in the school program. If we can verify their first dose, which would be by air, and we make sure that we follow the minimum dosing intervals of 6 calendar months, and if consent is given. So you can understand that That means that we really need anyone who gives a HPV vaccination or any vaccination to upload those onto the AIR, because that's the only way that we have of checking whether those doses have been given or not. And as you can imagine, a student turns up to a desk and the nurse diligently says, "Have you had these vaccines anywhere else?" "Oh, yes, I have. I had vaccines at the doctor last week." "Well, what did you have?" "I'm sure it was this one." But we have to be able to check what they actually had. So if you put them onto the AIR, we can then easily check what the child had. Invariably, it's an influenza vaccine. Once upon a time, it was a travel vaccine, not likely anymore, or a COVID vaccine. So how do we catch up with the school kids? We obviously prefer that the kids remain in the school program, because that lets us keep track of what's going on. It lets us keep track of how we're going, how much do we need to chase kids. And as you can imagine, it's an opt-in program. So the kids are given a consent form package to take home for their parents to sign and bring it back. So there's lots of things that can go wrong with that. And so we are at mercy of whatever consent forms come back. Hopefully in the very near future, we're looking at an online platform where consent's given online. So we're hoping that that will clear up those anomalies that happen with the child taking that card home. So our teams diligently follow up any student who's missed vaccines at every clinic that we go out to. So if they think they've been lucky by being missed at the first one, they're in for bad luck, because we're coming back for them. When we miss them at school, we send an SMS to all parents letting them know that we've missed their child today, and we let them know where we can catch them up. This is what we do in Newcastle and quite a few of our teams. Students can attend their GP for their catch-up vaccinations, but we understand that you've done a great job so far and that you are really slammed with everything else. So please don't hesitate to direct them back to the school program if you really can't facilitate. We have had a couple of parents indicate that doctors have given them a script to go and get their HPV or Booster-X vaccination or their meningococcal vaccination. Please just have discussions in your practice, because that shouldn't happen. And just remember that these vaccines are available free up to the age of 20 in their GPs. The other alternative at the present is that we will send parents a message, and one of the options we give them is to come down to the vaccination hub at Belmont between the hours of 3 and 5 on a Monday to Friday to come and get vaccinated for their school program. No appointment necessary, they can just walk in whenever it suits them. The only thing is, as Paddy alluded to before, Belmont Hub is closing and we're moving to Walls End. So the last day that you'll be able to turn up direct kids to Belmont will be Saturday the 25th of June. And then we'll let parents know, whoever's ready for a catch-up, when we're ready for them at Walls End at the new hub. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you've got any questions about the school vaccination program. We're more than happy to talk to you. Sorry about my croaky voice. So these are our hopes for 2022. That schools don't close anymore, that clinics are not cancelled, and everyone comes to school. Sorry, Paddy.
Right, all good.
I'll let you introduce Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That's fantastic. So the school program's really, really important. Fits with that vaccine idea of vaccinating healthy people before they get sick, and especially when you think of cervical cancer. Before the program, used to kill about a huge number of young, healthy adult women. Probably very representative of the group who are watching this. So that's a really, really important program for young women and young men to be able to get that vaccine. I'd like to introduce Rebecca Johnson, who's a wonderful CNC with expertise in healthcare worker immunisation and newly developed expertise in adverse events, and she's going to talk about both of those things now. Thanks, Rebecca.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm Beck and going to talk about adverse events in healthcare workers. Before I do that, not adverse events in healthcare workers, two separate topics. But before I do that, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the beautiful Awabakal land and pay my respects to Aboriginal people tuned in and elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so we've kind of moved through the lifespan. Patty's talked about vaccinating kids, Sharon's talked about vaccinating people in school program, and the other really large burden of vaccination that falls in general practice and in staff health clinics is vaccinating healthcare workers. So that's all, you know, the Australian government kind of sets the schedule for everybody up until 20 and says these are the vaccines we recommend and fund. Healthcare workers, it's set by a policy directive that New South Wales Health says that this is a condition of you applying for a job here, is we need to keep you safe by making sure that you're vaccinated. This policy is currently under review, so if a new one comes out next month and you think, you know, Rebecca said something different last month, it is under review, and that will be communicated to everybody once it's all been looked at by all the stakeholders and those changes have been put in place. The important thing to note about this policy and why the burden falls particularly on general practice now is that the requirements need to be met before you get your job. So all of you, if you want to go and study nursing, study medicine, study midwifery, podiatry, anything that means you want to set foot in a hospital, you'll be given a package in year one at uni and told go out and make sure your vaccines are up to date. If you want to apply for a job to, you know, cook in the kitchen at the hospital, you want to apply for a job, you know, doing the garden at the hospital, you'll be given a package and told go out and make sure your vaccines are up to date before you can have your job. So that's why people land in general practice for the most part. Once you're already in, then there's a whole team that does a really great job of making sure all of our hospital-based workers remain up to date and get any additional vaccines that are recommended. This very complex table, I'm not going to speak to it, but just so that you've got access to it if you're looking back on the slides, really does summarise the vaccines that are recommended for everybody that works within healthcare in New South Wales. So you've got your diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, your hepatitis B, measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, influenza, screening for tuberculosis, not vaccination, so we won't speak to that. And COVID-19 up till this point sat outside under the public health order recommendations, and we'll be notified if there's any changes in that area. That very complex table really kind of talks to the burden of evidence. So when we're saying you're safe to come and work with the really vulnerable people in the hospital, you're safe to come in and do really high risk activities like do operations on people and not contract hepatitis B, we really want to be quite sure that the vaccines you're saying you've had, you've actually had. So, you know, if you entered the hospital system, you know, maybe 30 years ago and you said, oh yeah, I think I had a whooping cough vaccine at some point, we didn't have these policies and probably said that was fine. Whereas the burden for work health and safety is really quite high to make sure that when you're coming into a workplace that you're safe yourself, where you're protected from catching a vaccine preventable disease yourself, and you've also, you know, have had the vaccines required to make sure you're not going to pass things on. So you may find, you know, if you gave someone a vaccine or you signed one of these forms and they're coming back and somebody said, oh, that's not good enough, it's because that burden of evidence is quite high. So your best bet is to put everything as to reinstate what's already been said today, put any vaccines that you've given onto the immunisation register and provide that as a printout. Then you don't have a 19-year-old that goes off and loses their piece of paper and comes back next month. It's there for them to download as many times as they want. You know, I'm 38 and I lose things, so, you know, it's not age specific. And the next best thing is for hepatitis B under this policy, a blood test to establish antibody response is required. So providing them, AIR doesn't have a facility for this, so you would need to provide a printout on that pathology letterhead that's really official, put your signature on it, pop your stamp on it. A lot of people are given that red card, which can be used, but it must be completed to the standard of that example there. It's no good if the student kind of writes in a couple of dates themselves and brings it along, that'll get rejected. It's no good if you write up to date as per childhood schedule, that'll get rejected. We've really got to see what vaccine was given and when. So as I mentioned, it has to it all has to mirror the immunisation handbook. So for hepatitis B, some things that get quite complex is it really does need to be an age-appropriate course with minimum intervals met. So if they were given too close together, we'll ask somebody to have another dose so that they've had that course correctly. And again, this is because if I'm going to say you need to go in there and you can stick your hands inside somebody and do some really risky procedure, we want to make sure you're absolutely not going to be at risk of contracting hepatitis B. It's a great vaccine and we do rely on it for protecting healthcare workers for their entire career, so we want to make sure we get it right. Hep B is the only vaccine where serology is recommended. We kind of like to see things in black and white. Vaccinating somebody seems a little bit abstract. How do I know I've given you this vaccine and you're definitely protected? And it's tempting to think, oh, I'll run a blood test and I'll see if your antibodies have changed. Those blood tests for everything except hepatitis B are not really designed to give us a lot of information about whether that vaccine has worked. We know vaccines work based on the epidemiological data and the long-term studies that we've done around. We vaccinated everybody and we saw those rates of disease go down, and you've seen those kind of charts in many of our other talks previously. So that's reflected in this policy as well, and the practice that you want to have. For the DTPA vaccines, serology is not accepted at all. An ADT vaccine is not accepted, and it needs to be within the last 10 years. And again, because that epidemiological data says we give you a whooping cough vaccine, it gives you some protection for a little while, but by about 10 years, it's starting to wane off, and if we want to make sure you're still protected, we've got to give you another one. Healthcare workers are constantly under a risk of being exposed because they're looking after the people who are sick with things like whooping cough, so we need to keep them protected. Now, MMR and varicella, my slide got a bit mucked up there, sorry. So you can do serology for MMR. It will be accepted if you've got somebody who is really quite adamant that they did have a vaccine, not keen to go and repeat that. You can do a serology, and if it comes up immune, that's accepted under the policy. However, it's not routinely recommended. Again, that test is designed for checking to see if people got sick with the virus. It's not a really sensitive test to vaccine-derived immunity. We know if we give you 2 doses of MMR vaccine, that's got a 99% efficacy. We don't need to prove that on a blood test. So your best evidence to know that you're protected for measles, mumps and rubella is 2 doses that are documented. If you happen to go and do a serology and it's not showing that everything's immune, if you imagine my arrows have moved back a little bit there, we have to respond to that. So even though you've had 2 doses, if we went and did a serology, even though it's not recommended, we'd still have to go in and give you a booster because we've gone and done it and we need to respond to it because it might be right. If you've got 1 dose documented, we'd just come in and come on with that 2nd dose. And if we've got no doses written down, even if the person in front of you feels quite sure that they've had 2 vaccines in the past, if we can't find that written down anywhere, all we can do is recommend that you should have 2 doses. They're safe, they're effective, and you're going to be immune forever. Don't lose this piece of evidence. I'll put it on air for you. And just important to note, the absolute minimum interval is 28 days between live vaccines. So sometimes there's a little bit of pressure when it's for somebody getting a job or things like that. You might want to bring it forward. If you bring it below that 28 days, it's going to make life a whole lot harder because it won't be accepted, and then they've got to wait another 28 days before they can have a valid dose. Much the same for varicella, but even more so discouraging around serology. The attenuated virus that we use in a varicella vaccine is slightly different to the wild virus. That's how we've kind of created I didn't do it. The very clever people created that vaccine. So when you go and do a blood test, that blood test is really specific for, has this person had wild type varicella? So it's quite rare that a vaccinated person will give you a really good immune result on a blood test. But again, we go back to that epidemiological data. If they're an adult, they've had 2 doses of varicella vaccine, it's about 99% effectiveness as well. So we don't need to prove that on serology. We just want to assume the level of protection based on them having a valid course. Other practice points, that if somebody under 50 is inadvertently given a Zostavax, that is a drug error, but it is an acceptable vaccine. It's a much higher dose than a varicella vaccine, so we're not going to turn around and give them even more vaccine. We're going to assume that they are very well protected. So that's the end of healthcare workers for now. The new policy should be coming out within a matter of months. So as things change, we'll update these talks. Any questions, pop it in the Slido. And I'm going to move on to adverse events. I feel like I talked a bit slower. Nobody's rushing me off, so I'll just keep at this pace. So adverse events and healthcare worker vaccinations, very separate things, just 2 of my areas of interest. So over the course of 2021, we vaccinated the entire population, which really provided an opportunity to develop these skills in following up adverse events following immunisation, as we really had an enhanced surveillance system for the COVID-19 vaccine, so that we could really be reassuring the community that we're paying attention to what's going on. And that really speaks to that first quote that I've popped up there, that really it's been shown that people who feel like they can't trust if they're feeling hesitant about a vaccine, and a lot of people have identified, I'm hesitant about having this vaccine because I'm not sure if I can trust that this vaccine is safe, and I'm not sure that I can trust that if I do have an adverse event following immunisation, it's going to be taken seriously and it's going to be looked at. So across all of New South Wales, particularly over COVID, everyone was encouraged to play a really big role in looking at what people were experiencing and taking it seriously and investigating reports. So we did have an enhanced AFI surveillance system where we really encouraged vaccine providers and the community to report anything uncommon, anything serious or anything unexpected, which was felt to be significant. And you report that to the public health unit, which is, for the most part, the people that you've seen here today and a couple of others that couldn't come. And you can use whatever form you can get your hands on. The feds have got a form. New South Wales brought out a form last year. We'll take whatever you've got available to you. And so what's serious and significant, that there's a link there, that chart might be a little bit hard to read, it's a lot of information, but there is an enhanced safety surveillance reporting guidelines. And essentially what that's saying is, what's a non-serious adverse event? We give you a vaccine, we're stimulating your immune system. There's known things that we do. Typically when we stimulate your immune system, it doesn't feel particularly good for the individual. So things like fever, muscle aches and pains, a swollen arm, they're expected reactions. It's really important to advise people when you immunise them to expect those things and to give them advice on what to do about that. We kind of take it for granted as nurses that if you feel a bit sick, you're going to keep yourself hydrated, you're going to rest, you're going to take some paracetamol. But not everybody necessarily knows that, and it's really important advice to impart to people that you're vaccinating. Things that are serious are some rare things that we want to keep a look out for. We've all become quite aware of disorders of clotting. Anaphylaxis is really important. I'll speak to that a little bit more. Things like Bell's palsy, which is when a facial nerve is inflamed and you can get drooping of the face and and persistent lymphadenopathy that's causing quite a concern, and new neurological symptoms. So one that people may be aware of is things like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which has been talked about a bit around the AstraZeneca vaccine, and in the past, influenza vaccine. And it's just important to note with adverse events that if we do nothing, many people get many conditions every day of the week that are unusual, are new to them. If we vaccinated them or not, we're going to see those things. So if it occurred 6 weeks following a vaccine, we would encourage you to report it. You don't need to be the person that analyses and tries to convince the patient one way or another. Report it, and we'll take it quite seriously. And your reports matter. In 2021, Hunter New England Public Health Unit investigated over 1,000 reports, and you can just see here a little makeup of the kinds of vaccines they were for. Obviously, the majority were for COVID-19 vaccines, with AstraZeneca representing the largest group. Okay. I'll speed it up a bit. So vaccine safety in children is particularly important. People are, and there have been lots of concerns about people. I've had this vaccine for myself, but is it safe to give to children? And just these reports are taken and publicised quite transparently. This is from the TGA of the number of reports that we have received up until the last weekly safety report on the 29th of May for young children with the COVID-19 vaccines. And of the serious adverse events, you can see that there were 33 reports of suspected myocarditis or pericarditis, and it looks like 4 represented a true case of myocarditis, and 6 represented a case of pericarditis. So of the huge number of the millions of doses we have given out, we take all these reports quite seriously, but it's incredibly rare, those serious adverse events that we do want you to look out for. It's important to see them, but important to put into context how rare they are. And your reports matter because they change policy. Speaking of the myocarditis and pericarditis, you can see by vaccine providers putting in those reports, it gets escalated up, and then it changes policy with things like item numbers being added so that people who are being investigated for myocarditis can now access an MRI to investigate that adverse event and let them know if that has occurred. And just to further reinforce that all the transparency matters, the TGA do publicise even the sadder adverse events. There were 11 reports that were confirmed to be deaths related to first dose AstraZeneca vaccine. This is publicly available on the website that anybody can see. So you can use that kind of information when there's a little bit of vaccine hesitancy that, but it's all these people are dying from vaccines and it's being covered up. When there are deaths, we pay attention, the TGA pays attention, and they let the public know. And that also changed policy to make that vaccine safer and use it in groups of people that were at less risk of that adverse event. And just real quick, Patty touched on a little bit those expected reactions. It's important to use this information, say, when we have a flu vaccine, you might feel things that feel like the flu. I felt like I had a fever, I had a headache, I felt a bit run down. It's important to tell people that is expected, and give them some real facts to not play into that vaccine hesitancy. You didn't catch the flu, but the vaccine did make you feel fairly ordinary, and you can use resources like these NCIS resources. I'm just going to move into a bit on anaphylaxis. As immunisers, those immediate adverse events are the things that you're most likely to be aware of and be looking out for, and anaphylaxis is the one that we're most concerned about as immunisers, as we know that anaphylaxis can be life-threatening. It's important to be prepared, but be calm and know that you do have time to assess your person, to do your top to tail nursing assessment that you would do for anyone, to take your observations and really get an idea of what's going on. It's really important if somebody is experiencing anaphylaxis to get that adrenaline in, but you do have time. It's not a cardiac arrest where you need to act immediately. You have time to do some observations, to assess the person and make a decision about whether they're experiencing anaphylaxis or one of the other possible differential diagnoses. Anaphylaxis is a bit of a cascade. It's rapid. You're going to see those large quantities of histamine released, causing the angioedema, capillary leak. You're going to see possibly skin reactions. You're going to see swelling. You're going to hear bronchospasms, trouble breathing, and you may see shock, a drop in BP, a decreased cardiac output. We give them adrenaline and we start to reverse those effects. We increase their cardiac contraction. We open up their airway. We reverse that peripherally vasodilation, and it suppresses the release of antihistamine and they recover. There's very little risk to giving somebody adrenaline that didn't need it. If you're concerned about anaphylaxis, you should use the adrenaline, but you do have time to really assess what's going on there. There's some anaphylaxis resources that you may want to use to skill up. Askia runs an online training course if you want to add that to your CPD points. But it's important, communication matters if you're going to go and use that adrenaline. It could be anaphylaxis, seizure, syncope, or something else. So there's a lot of things that do look like anaphylaxis in that post-vaccination setting, and anaphylaxis is the only life-threatening one. So that's where you get, if you want to give the adrenaline because you're concerned, you absolutely should. You're in a general practice, and that's the right thing to do. But communication matters. Letting the person know we've done this set of obs, anaphylaxis can be life-threatening, we're not 100% sure, so we're going to give you this adrenaline. But it could be a syncope, which is a faint. People can drop, they can get, they get their low pallor, their breathing sounds a bit funny and you're concerned. That could be what's happening. Sometimes when people have a syncope, they can get them twitching, jerking, and you could be concerned that it looks like a seizure. And there's some information there to help you determine the difference as well. It's quite common to get twitching and jerking with a syncope. It's quite uncommon to experience a new seizure following a vaccine. And then one of the other differential diagnoses for anaphylaxis is vocal cord dysfunction, which is, if you can see in that little picture there, usually when you breathe in, your vocal cord opens up. In response to stress, some people get this paradoxal movement where they're trying to breathe in and their vocal cord closes down. And that can really give you that sound of stridor. The person feels a sense of throat fullness. It's a differential diagnosis to anaphylaxis prior to COVID, but during COVID, there's really been a lot more research looking into vaccines being a trigger for this kind of event, which has, led to adrenaline being used because of concerns for anaphylaxis. And those studies there is Monash Clinic got people in when they were given adrenaline after dose 1 COVID, and they suspected vocal cord dysfunction as the differential diagnosis. They got people in and put a scope down their throat when they gave them dose 2, and were able to get images that really did show that that's what was occurring, and they didn't have any of the other signs of anaphylaxis. So there's some things to consider. So in summary on anaphylaxis, you have time to assess your patient, Communication matters. If you do decide to give the adrenaline, that's a good decision and you should run with that, but letting the patient know anaphylaxis is one of the things that could be going on. There are other things, and a referral to a specialist is what's going to happen next to figure out what's happened. And taking bloods like a serum tryptase really does help as to differentiate between whether there's been an allergic response going on or something else. And that is the end of me, I think. And Patty's going to come back and finish up.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a really good message with anaphylaxis. You've got time. So as healthcare workers, we're trained to react very quickly and to, if someone collapses, they could be having a heart attack, and seconds matter, and we're very good at that. In anaphylaxis, it's a cascade of things going on, and you have time to react, like Rebecca says. So it's really, really important that you assess. Do things like take someone's blood pressure, because if they're having anaphylaxis, their blood pressure will drop. You've got time to do OBS. So that message from Rebecca's really fantastic. And the vocal cord dysfunction is newly described, and hopefully we'll be able to get some more, gather some more data and get some more information to you on that. So our dear colleague Chris Staples recently retired. She put this cold chain presentation together. She's quite an expert on that. So I'll just run through these slides on her behalf. So Chris lives in Newcastle. This was the Pasha Bolka. This is one of her photos. And it's there because, the ship's up on the shore because of a huge storm. And unsurprisingly, every vaccination refrigerator in every GP practice north of Gosford and south of Port Macquarie went out. There was huge vaccine failures. So that's why it's there, apart from being a spectacular photo. So vaccine storage is absolutely critical. So this is worth investing time in to get it right, because it can be a real hassle if you don't. So quality vaccination service is really, really important. So we do want people to have vaccines. We want to talk to people who are a bit hesitant about having vaccines. But what we can guarantee, absolutely guarantee, is the vaccines we give people are in really good quality and have been stored properly. That's really, really important. So people expect when they come to a clinic or a hospital that they're going to get a quality vaccine, and there's some famous instances where that hasn't been the case. So really, really important. So vaccine storage is really critical, and there's some great resources. So I'm going to talk about vaccine storage as the cold chain, which is between 2 and 8 degrees. Obviously with Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines for COVID, there's stored frozen until they're thawed and used. So that I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about regular cold chain for vaccines. Again, our website is absolutely superb. Chris, who we're honouring with this presentation today, put a lot of work into this website, and now a lot of these resources are on the website to save you spending the time to call us. So why do we keep talking about vaccine storage? Because sometimes we get it right, and this is a fridge that looks pretty good. It's got a chart on the front for charting. It's got a minimum max. It's got heaps of warning stickers, making sure the cleaner doesn't unplug the fridge. But sometimes we don't get it right. So this fridge is overcrowded, the air can't circulate, and those vaccines will be frozen because the fridge can't circulate the air and work properly. So we must get that right. Now, a lot of vaccines will cope with a little bit above 8. Most vaccines are instantly no good once it goes below 0. So our normal range is between 2 and 8. There's a very small interval between 2 and 0. So freezing vaccines is a really big problem. Most vaccines around the world that are lost to cold chain are lost to freezing. So how do we manage the cold chain? So on the left-hand side is a vaccine storage audit to do yourself, to go through the steps to guide you, and there's a great acronym on the right-hand side, another PPE, people, processes and equipment. So the vaccine storage audits available on the Commonwealth website. It's a QAS program, really, really important to do yourself. So the equipment that you need a data logger. Absolutely essential you have a data logger. There's several brands on the market and more all the time. But you must still do the manual checking, because the manual checking allows you to eyeball the fridge and see what's actually going on, whereas the data logger will tell you after the fact. If you're downloading the logger once a week and you've seen that a few days ago the vaccines were frozen and you've been vaccinating, all those people need to be recalled. You don't want that to be the situation. Now, there are, the loggers are getting smarter all the time. They can connect to our smartphones, they connect to the fridge, but you still need to eyeball, or at least look at your phone every day and take a static reading. Really, really important. But even better, to eyeball the fridge. Think about an ICU situation. You've got a nurse in ICU. The nurse obviously looks after the ventilator and all the equipment and the monitoring, but be very negligent never to look at the patient and get your real information from the patient. Same, you need to be eyeballing the fridge, not just looking at your smart thing on the phone, except for the weekends and out of hours, of course. So the set duration for the data logger is every 5 minutes. You must have a battery-operated min-max thermometer so that if the power does go out, that's going to tell you what's happening with your vaccines. So what else do you need? You need stickers so that the power is not turned off accidentally. You need to do a nice slurry test for your min-max thermometer and your data logger once every 12 months. Instructions on our website. You absolutely need to plot the temperatures every day manually, as well as monitor it with a data logger. And make sure that the vaccines arrive in good condition. And check those temperature probes when they turn up. So reporting a cold chain breach is really, really important. They must be reported to your local public health unit. I see a lot of people watching this from outside Hunter, New England, so do contact your local public health unit and get advice if you have a cold chain breach. So these are the steps. And for people in Hunter, New England, if you go to our website, you can go to the cold chain section and you can fill out the form and complete that. And if you fill in section 4, you can put in how many doses of a particular vaccine you've got in the fridge. And if that particular vaccine's been through a breach before, you can put that in brackets. Then you send that to us. So you haven't had to pick up the phone. You can send that to us. We can then look at your data. You send it with the data logging. We can look at the data logger, look at the information you've given, and then provide advice back to you. So that's a much quicker than ringing up and reading out all the how many vaccines you've got in the fridge. So we've tried to streamline this process for your benefit and for our benefit. It used to be much more time consuming before. So make sure you monitor your fridge, contact us. If you're not sure, then please give us a ring. Really, really important. And that's the final section of the form where we'll provide advice back to you. So the take-home messages. Ensure you have a battery-operated min-max thermometer. No matter how smart your operating thing is, you still need a separate min-max thermometer. Change your battery regularly. Make sure your fridge is serviced every 12 months. You might have a beer fridge in the garage that seems to go forever with no attention, but your vaccine fridge is much more finely tuned, much more sensitive to going wrong, and you need to make sure that it's serviced every 12 months. That's really important. Like changing your tyres on the car, you'll prevent a lot of problems if you get that serviced regularly and keep a record of that. Set your data logger for every 5 minutes, making sure the battery's replaced regularly. Ensure no vaccines are stored in the bottom compartment on the floor of the fridge, because that will be a cooler temperature than the rest of the fridge. Ensure your staff, everyone knows how to use the logger. It's not uncommon that one nurse at the practice will know how to use the logger, but if that nurse isn't at work the day the power goes off, then no one knows what to do. That's obviously inadequate. You need to make sure that everyone knows how to download that logger, especially the clerical staff. They're really, really efficient at that sort of thing. Complete your annual audit and make sure you purchase a purpose-built vaccination fridge. So the vaccination fridge will cost a practice a lot of money, $3,000 or $4,000, and it is a big investment. But the vaccines you have inside that fridge can be $30,000 or $40,000 a month. So the smallest investment in the cold chain is the fridge. The vaccines that go through your fridge with the NIP program are free. Gardasil costs the state government $100 each. You can hold 10 of them in the palm of your hand. There's $1,000. So it's the vaccine fridge. Your practice manager won't like the expense, but it's absolutely essential that is in good condition and that it works really well. And you'll save yourself a lot of hassles. If things go wrong, then you may have to recall people, and that's not good for the practice. If things go really wrong, people think they've been vaccinated with vaccines that'll work. They won't work. They'll get the disease and get crook or worse. So really, really important part of your practice. It takes time to set up, but it's worth the investment, and then things will tick along, and then you can be looking after patients rather than looking after your fridge. Now, PROTA, so the access to the Australian Immunisation Register has changed recently, and it's sort of become a bit more complex. So you really need the PROTA digital access, either mainly through your practice. So you need a RA number and you need to be able to register. So that's absolutely important. If you need to update that number, send us the information that PROTA sends you and we'll be able to update that, and we're hoping to streamline some of these new systems when we understand them a little bit better. So Chris was absolute stalwart of immunisation in the Hunter, New England region. That's her right in the middle. These are some of her pictures, and I've put them up here because hopefully there's some Hunter, New England people tuning in. You might be able to see yourself. On the lower right-hand side is the school immunisation program in the days of consent forms that we still have, and we're hoping to say goodbye to that next year thanks to eHealth and Dennis and many other operators. You might recognise yourself in some of these pictures. So Chris has been all over rural Hunter, New England. One of the big changes in her career was the digital handbook, and now the COVID chapter is now online as well. So that's terrific. Get updated information. Again, some friends and some outreach, and that's Chris on the bottom left. She had a terrible bout of cancer, had some treatment, and that was successful, and now she's having a wonderful, healthy retirement. But that cancer, she had a stem cell transplant, and she's quite keen to let you know that vaccinations for people with stem cell transplants are absolutely critical. Those conditions are really, really susceptible to lots of infections, especially to streptococcus. So really important that we're up to date with vaccinating people who've had stem cell transplants. There's a great fact sheet from the Melbourne Vaccination Education Centre. Direct you to there. The NCS has a great fact sheet. The table in the handbook is very, very helpful, and on the bottom right-hand side, a link to Spleen Australia. So the Melbourne Vaccination Education Centre fact sheet and Spleen Australia fact sheet, really, really helpful. And on the bottom left, the PneumoSmart tool is really good for people with pneumococcus. Now, I had some slides, but I haven't got them up on this presentation. Just to remind you about Zoster. Zostavax is free and funded for people over 70, but cannot be given to people who are immunosuppressed. Now, there is a separate vaccine that's not funded called Shingrix from a different company that is licensed for people over 18, but you have to purchase it. Yep, but that may be worth it if you're immunosuppressed or you want to prevent shingles. Now, it is an expensive vaccine. It's sort of $200, $250 a dose. It's a 2-dose course, but it's an inactivated vaccine, has a great safety record, and can be given to people who are immunosuppressed. And if immunosuppressed, you might be more likely to get shingles. Now, you might think $500 is a lot of money, which of course it is. And with the cost of living going up, it seems to be more and more money every day. But if you're in the middle of a big shingles outbreak on your body, then you might think $500 was well spent. So that vaccine recommended for people over 18 years of age. Zostavax is available and funded for people at 70. And remember, of course, the pneumococcal vaccine has now moved from 65. Pneumovax 23 not given at 65 anymore, but Prevnar 13 available free and funded on the NIP for people at 70. So that's 70 mark rather than 65. Now, of course, you've listened very politely to all this, but what you really tuned in for was monkeypox. Everyone wants to know about monkeypox. I think it's just because it's got a sexy, interesting name. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about it. Because compared to COVID, COVID's killed millions of people around the world. We don't get any COVID questions anymore. We just get questions about monkeypox. So monkeypox was from Central Africa, of course, from the 70s. There was also a clade from West Africa, but not quite as deadly. It's not only monkeys, it's other animals, probably rodents more than monkeys, but monkeys make it interesting when we start to talk about it. Now, the case fatality rate for the Congo clade is up towards 10%. Now, I've got the reason I show this because there's some pictures here you might not have seen. So it's very similar sort of presentation to chickenpox and smallpox. It starts off with a small papule which turns into a vesicle. In monkeypox, the hands and feet are overrepresented. You can see on the bottom left-hand side the hands with the vesicles, and on the right-hand side they dry into blisters. So it's about somewhere between a 4 and 21, usually 7 to 12 day incubation period, and you get flu-like illness, fever, fatigue, very common symptoms for an infection, and then when they settle, the rash comes out, and this is sort of what it looks like. Now, we're not vaccinating widespread, but for where there's a case, there may be indications to, and in Europe they're vaccinating people around that case with the old smallpox vaccine. There are 5 cases so far in New South Wales. You need fairly intense contact to catch it, so it's certainly not going to be anything like what we've had with COVID, and I don't really think it needs a lot of attention. COVID's much more important. So the messages from today, just to sum up, and then we'll answer some of your questions in a Q&A sort of thing. I'll invite Beck and Sharon to come out and give me a hand, because they're much better with the right answers than I am. And so the messages from today is that for COVID vaccine, if we really want to stop the virus moving around, young adults, a lot of young adults haven't had the 3rd dose. Winter dose for people over 65 and for people vulnerable. Influenza vaccine, really, really important for everyone over 6 months, especially for kids. Kids are overrepresented in emergency department presentations with cough and fever, and kids spread that virus around, and the vaccine's free and funded for kids over 6 months of age. Aboriginal immunisation, absolutely critical. Really, really important to keep Aboriginal people as healthy as possible. A lot of Aboriginal people have a lot against them in Australia. We're trying to overcome that, but vaccination's a simple way of making sure that kids grow up as healthy as they can, and especially if you've got Aboriginal teenagers, making sure they're up to date with their school vaccinations and Gardasil, really, really important. Childhood vaccines, you may have been vaccinating a lot of adults the last few years. Make sure you're familiar with that schedule and keep kids up to date, and think of innovative ways you can get kids into your practice and vaccinate them with childhood vaccines. School vaccination programs been knocked around as school attendance has been knocked around in the last few years. Again, a really important group for preventative vaccines. We really want to make sure that those kids are vaccinated either at school or in other ways of catching up, like Sharon nicely outlined. Healthcare workers, really, really important. They're your colleagues. Really important in general practice to know exactly what healthcare workers need, because they'll come to you first before they go to the hospital. Rebecca nicely outlined that we've been doing a lot of work in adverse events in Hunter, New England, and the last with the pandemic, making sure that those vaccines are as safe as possible, and for the odd person that has a nasty reaction to the vaccine, that they're looked after, and the team's done a great job of that. Vaxtracker, we're keeping an eye on safety. So there's nothing hidden about vaccines. So you might talk to people and think, oh, I'm really worried about this vaccine or that vaccine because I've heard it does this or that. The things it does, we tell you about. If we haven't told you, that vaccine probably doesn't have that negative effect. So vaccine safety is really important. So if you do get someone bounce back to you and they say, hey, you gave me this vaccine and now this has happened to me, make sure you report it as an adverse event. We don't want anything hidden. That doesn't mean every sore arm and every little bit of fever, but it does mean events that concern the person. But they're not expected. events. Make sure you tell people about the expected events before you vaccinate them so they know what to expect. Especially with children, make sure parents can manage fever. If you've got some Panadol in the house and the nurses told you how to manage fever, then when if a baby wakes up at 1 o'clock in the morning with a fever, you'll know what to do and you can manage that. Otherwise, you're down the emergency department in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the night. So really, really important, especially in our society at the moment, where often adult children having children are not near their own parents for advice. Doctors and nurses, healthcare workers have a really important role about giving people good health information so that they're equipped and they know what to do. Really, really important. So that vaccine's not something you do in a millisecond and just jab someone in the arm and get them to move on. Give them information so they're equipped with how to manage afterwards. An informed person is much better equipped. So invite Rebecca and Sharon out and we'll have a look at see what sort of questions we've got. Please fire in some questions on Slido and we'll have a crack at answering them. Thanks, Sharon, Rebecca. Wonderful tech guy, Chris, just adjusting the camera. Awesome. Oh, I'm sitting, I think.
We don't have very many questions.
Oh, good.
Yep, which is probably good.
Thank you.
So a very relevant question we have is, if a 65-year-old has had a Novavax, do they need another at 70?
Oh, not another Novavax, but they do need the Prevnar 13 at 70. Yep. So the Prevnar 13 is the conjugated vaccine. It works better than the pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine that we were giving at 65. So really important that they get that superior vaccine at 70 where it's free and funded.
Are the monkeypox cases in Sydney?
Oh, that's a great question. I read there were 5 in New South Wales, but I didn't look anymore. I would imagine they're concentrated in Sydney, but I don't know.
Do you want to talk about light-sensitive vaccines at all? When we talk about light-sensitive vaccines, what are we actually meaning?
So if you've got a lightsaber like Luke Skywalker? No.
Possibly, yeah.
So the really, really important when you store vaccines that they're stored in their original packaging. A lot of people are tempted to take them out of their original packaging to save room in the fridge. That's an absolute complete no-no. One of the reasons we keep them in their original packaging is to protect them from light. So things will denature vaccines. Vaccines are biological products. So they're cells, they can denature because of poor temperature storage or because of exposure to light. So like in the old days, we used to kill infection by taking things out into the sunlight. I don't think that's as fashionable these days, but it's the same with vaccines. So vaccines are light sensitive. Now, a lot of the refrigerators these days, especially in the southern part of Australia where it's not too hot, will have glass doors so the light can get in. So really, really important that they're kept in their original packaging because they can denature from light. Now, we can measure temperature and we can predict the deterioration of a vaccine with a cold or a warm temperature outside 2 and 8. We can't predict the damage to a vaccine with light. So any light exposure, we really have to dispose of those vaccines because it's not a known quantity. We have to be cautious, so we get rid of those vaccines. So it's not, you really don't want to expose your vaccines to light. We keep them in their original packaging.
So we have had a question on shortage of NIP childhood vaccines, and as far as I'm aware, Influenza was shortage. There was a shortage for a while. Is that still ongoing?
As we're busy looking to each other. So with as we're hearing about building materials and all sorts of things with a shortage with COVID and supply chains. A lot of the childhood vaccines that we use are made in Europe. Supply chains are stretched. There was a shortage with Influenza Hexa. I think Influenza Hexa is available, but you may find that if you order too much, you won't get as much as you normally order, and you'll have to be judicious with the use of it. But I think that supply is coming back online. But if people are having problems, contact your local public health unit. If you are using the online ordering system, New South Wales Health have a great information page, which is available at general practice and for hospitals that we can't see. So you will actually have better information than us when you're ordering. But do ring your public health unit if you don't get the order you expect and you're worried about shortages. But yes, there are vaccine shortages on and off more at the moment than there were pre-pandemic.
Thanks, Patty. So there's one little query about how do we run a report from air to see about overdue vaccines in children. So my suggestion there would be to email our generic inbox, HNE LHD -PH immunisation at health.gov.nsw.au. If you email that question through, we'll be able to send you some directions on how to do that, because that's a really important thing to do in general practice, to do that on a regular basis, because your clientele change all the time as well. And Patty, you are the font of all knowledge with these questions. Vaxtracker have received a lot of questions about how people can join Vaxtracker. So I have flicked people the link to the Vaxtracker monitoring system website. Is that
Yep,
the way
that's
to go?
perfect. Yes,
The
so you can
contact
look
page?
up, we've got a new website, vaxtracker.net. You can have a look there and contact us through that, or contact us and we'll can have a look at your situation. We're trying to roll Vaxtracker out now for general practice and for pharmacies locally. Yeah, so please be in touch and we can talk about that. Yep, absolutely. So it really depends on your individual circumstances.
That's really all of our questions. It's very concentrated around Vaxtracker, which is good.
Oh, okay.
Very important.
Yep, vaxtracker.net, please be in touch. And yeah, and I should point out that Chris is now retired. She had put together those last lot of slides. We miss her deeply. She's fully recovered from her cancer, and a lot of people in the Hunter, New England area know her very well. Education for immunisation, really important. The PHN have been a great partner. During the pandemic, a lot of new staff have come on vaccinating. Really welcome you into the immunisation family. Please keep in touch with these sort of issues through our website or keeping in touch with us, especially if you're going into a field you haven't worked in before. Did you want to add anything, Sharon?
No, keep doing a great job.
Rebecca?
To everyone who's new to immunising, keep in touch.
It's very exciting.
It is. Thank you everyone for watching. Thanks to Chris the
Thank
Tech,
you.
and thanks to the PHN for putting this on.
Hi, I'm Phoebe. I'm a Professional Development Officer with the PHN, and I just wanted to thank Patrick, Rebecca and Sharon and Paula for coming today. It was fantastic. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Can you please do complete the Slido survey? We need that information for your certificates. And have a good afternoon. Thank you.